They say fear ruled every inch of Gallowmere plantation except for one man. His name was Solomon, the oldest slave on the property. Too frail for the fields, too quiet to notice. The overseers mocked him, the masters forgot him, and the others called him cursed but not dangerous. Yet there was something in the way he watched the swamp, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Then came the new overseer. Young, proud, cruel. He laughed at the stories, called Solomon a ghost of no consequence. By the end of the season, he was gone. No blood, no struggle, just the sound of chains moving in the water long after the night went still. Tonight, we return to the Louisiana lowlands, where the earth remembers and the swamp never gives back what it takes. This is the old slave, no one feared until the overseer vanished without a trace. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe, and tell me where are you listening from tonight. Let's see how far Gallomere's shadow still reaches. Along the lower Bayou Dufresne, the air never truly cools, and the ground never fully dries. It is a place where the earth breathes slow, where water and memory mingle until they are one and the same. The moss there hangs so heavy it blots out the morning sun, and the insects hum in unison like a single, ancient heartbeat. People say the bayou keeps secrets, that it remembers what men wish it would forget. Some even claim the land itself can grow angry, that it can rise up and reclaim what it is owed. On certain nights, when the moon is thin and the air smells of rain and iron, the swamp makes a sound like metal dragging through mud. Old fishermen have heard it and turned back before casting their nets. They say it is the ghost of chains being pulled across the riverbed, that each clink is a soul still trying to find its way home. The elders never go near Bayou Dufresne after dark. They say that water isn't just deep, it's hungry. Long before anyone spoke of curses or hauntings, there was a plantation that stood on the edge of that bayou, a grand estate built on land that should have been left to the water. It was called Gallowmere. From the river, it looked beautiful, white columns, wide porches, and fields that stretched toward the horizon like a sea of green. But up close, the house leaned, its foundations sinking inch by inch into the soil. The walls creaked, even when there was no wind. Beneath its beauty lay a sickness that ran deep, as if the land itself resented what had been built upon it. The people who worked those fields often said they could feel the swamp beneath their feet. Sometimes it trembled when the overseer passed. Sometimes it whispered when the rain fell heavy. It was a living thing, that earth, and it watched. It watched when men were whipped, when prayers were buried under screams, when names were forgotten and bodies vanished into the reeds. It never forgot. So when the overseer disappeared one night, no one in Tangipahoa Parish was truly surprised. His name was Abram Voss, a man who believed fear was the same as respect, who treated every act of cruelty as a form of order. He had mocked the old superstitions, laughed at the blacksmith's warnings, and boasted that no ghost or curse could touch him. The morning after his disappearance, the river ran high and dark, carrying with it pieces of wood and iron that no one recognized. The sheriff came and searched, of course. He found Voss's boots standing neatly beside the blacksmith's forge, a pistol half buried in mud, and the ground still warm as though something beneath it had been burning. They dragged the bayou for days, pulled up roots, snakes, and bones too old to name, but never the man himself. The only sound that lingered was the clink of metal far below the surface, faint and rhythmic, like the beating of a heart that refused to stop. Even now, the locals say the swamp has moods. Some nights it sleeps, and all you hear are frogs and crickets. Other nights, when the wind moves slow and the trees lean close, you can hear it breathing, waiting, remembering, and listening for footsteps it once promised to take back. Gallowmere Plantation rose from the edge of Bayou Dufresne like a mirage that had overstayed its welcome. In the soft light of morning, it looked almost beautiful, wrapped in mist and silence, its white columns catching the first touch of sun. But beauty in that part of Louisiana was always deceitful. Beneath the sugar cane and magnolia, the land was restless. It shifted with every rainfall, swallowing fence posts and warping foundations, as if it resented the weight placed upon it. The locals said the ground was too soft for roots and too proud for redemption. The main house stood on the highest ridge of that low country, leaning just slightly, as though listening to something deep beneath it. The brickwork bore the stains of decades of rain and ash. Its balconies sagged, its shutters hung crooked, and its windows reflected nothing. At the back of the house, near the smokehouse and the stables, a narrow trail of sunken earth marked the entrance to something older than the plantation itself. Beneath Gallowmere ran a labyrinth of tunnels, carved by enslaved hands generations earlier. They were meant for storage at first, then for hiding, and finally for escaping. Some led nowhere. Others led to the swamp. When the wind shifted, the air that rose from those tunnels smelled faintly of iron and wet stone, like the breath of something sleeping. The fields surrounding the house stretched outward in every direction, vast and orderly, as if the land had been forced into obedience. From a distance, the sugar canes shimmered like gold, but up close, the stalks were thick and black-veined, the soil beneath them damp year-round. The enslaved who worked there said the fields whispered when no one else was around. They said the roots reached deeper than the crops, deeper even than the tunnels, and that sometimes when they dug, they struck wood, then bone. Gallowmere was not built for peace. Its beauty was a mask stretched over pain, its wealth drawn from suffering buried under the guise of harvest. The air itself felt heavy, as if filled with the memories of what had been taken and never returned. Each night the cicadas would fall silent all at once, and in that stillness came a low hum that seemed to rise from the soil. No one knew where it began, and no one dared to find out. The masters of Gallowmere came and went over the decades, their fortunes rising and falling like the river that fed their fields. But the land endured, watching each generation make the same mistake, believing it could be owned. The swamp did not care for names or deeds or lineage. It had no need to forgive or forget. Beneath the porch, where the boards were warped from humidity, the tunnel still breathed softly, carrying the faint echo of hammering, of shovels striking clay, and of prayers whispered to a God who seemed too far away to hear. By the time Abram Voss arrived to take charge of Gallowmere, the plantation already felt haunted not by ghosts, but by memory itself. The walls seemed to sigh when the wind pressed against them, and the floorboards creaked in slow complaint. The people who lived there had learned to move quietly, to listen before they spoke, to glance toward the ground before meeting another's eyes, because on that land, even silence had a story to tell. Solomon Griggs had been at Gallowmere longer than the house itself. Some said he was there when the first trees were cut, when the ground was still more water than soil. Others claimed he was born of the swamp, that he rose from the mud one morning with a hammer in his hand and fire in his eyes. Whatever the truth was, no one alive could remember a time before him. He was the plantation's blacksmith, its silent heart, its watcher. His forge sat near the edge of the fields, a dark stone building half swallowed by vines, and the air around it always smelled of iron, smoke, and rain. They said Solomon was near 100, though he never confirmed it. His beard was white as cotton, his skin carved with the deep lines of a life spent beneath firelight. His hands were thick, dark, and scarred, the kind of hands that looked like they could shape the world itself if given time. He was slow to speak, slower to anger, and when he did speak, people listened not because of volume, but because of weight. Every word carried something ancient, something that made even the cruelest overseer hesitate before answering. The enslaved at Gallowmere called him Old Iron, not because he was strong in the way men measure strength, but because he refused to bend. He had seen too many whips, too many masters, too many graves to fear another. When punishment was handed down, Solomon never flinched. When prayers were whispered in the night, his voice rose last and lowest, steady as the beat of his hammer. It was said that when he worked, the swamp listened, and that the rhythm of his forge echoed across the bayou like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. His forge was more than a place of labor. It was a boundary between worlds. The glow from within painted the trees in shifting shades of orange and red, and on some nights, When the fog rolled in thick from the bayou, the fire seemed to breathe. People claimed to see shapes in the smoke faces half-formed, eyes watching from the edges of the flame. Some said he spoke to them, the ones who had gone before, that the ringing of his hammer was not metal striking metal but a conversation between the living and the lost. No one ever saw Solomon pray aloud, but every tool that left his hands carried a kind of reverence. Shackles, plows, hinges, horseshoes, each was marked by the same perfect craftsmanship, the same cold precision. The overseers believed it was obedience. The people who knew him better understood it was something else entirely. Every strike was a record, every finished piece a memory forged into iron. In a land built on cruelty and silence, Solomon Griggs had become something beyond fear. He was a man who could not be broken, because he no longer belonged to the world that tried to break him. The fire that burned in his forge was older than the house, older than Gallowmere itself, and on nights when the wind carried that faint metallic hum across the fields, even the bravest men kept their distance. For as long as Solomon's hammer struck, the swamp would never sleep. When Abram Voss arrived at Gallowmere Plantation, the sky was the color of pewter and the air was thick enough to taste. He came on horseback from Natchez, dressed in fine boots and arrogance, carrying a pistol that gleamed brighter than his eyes. He was the kind of man who believed power was inherited, not earned, and that cruelty was the proof of control. His reputation had preceded him, a young overseer with a firm hand and no patience for what he called superstition. The owners of Gallowmere thought him a man of efficiency. The people who worked the fields saw something else entirely, something brittle behind his confidence, something that would soon break. The first thing Abram noticed was the silence. Other plantations hummed with movement, with the clang of chains, the murmur of voices, the endless rhythm of survival. But Gallowmere seemed to hold its breath as he rode in. The fields were alive with cicadas, yet the sound felt distant, muffled, as if swallowed by the earth. He saw the slaves pause their work just long enough to look up at him, not with the fear he expected, but with something quieter, almost like pity. The only one who didn't look away was the old blacksmith by the forge. Solomon Griggs stood in the doorway, the glow of his fire painting his face in shades of gold and shadow. He didn't bow or nod or offer greeting. He simply stared, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady. Abram's lip curled. He called the old man a scarecrow in front of everyone, hoping to draw laughter, to remind them who held authority now. But no one laughed. The field hands kept their eyes low, their movements careful, and the sound of the hammering stopped for the first time that morning. That night the crows came, dozens of them, black as burnt coal, covering the rooftops, the trees, even the bell tower that hadn't rung in years. They sat in silence until the sun began to rise, then took flight all at once, filling the air with a shriek that sounded more like warning than song. Abram called it nonsense when the workers muttered about omens, but he couldn't explain why his horse refused to go near the forge the next day, or why the nails in his quarters had begun to rust overnight. In the evenings, he patrolled the grounds with his pistol drawn, convinced that the people he ruled were planning rebellion. What he never considered was that the rebellion might not come from them at all. The swamp around Gallowmere was old, older than his name or his bloodline, and it had no use for men who built cruelty into their trade. It watched him with the patience of water, waiting for the right moment to pull him under. Abram Voss thought he was the master of Gallowmere, but the land had already decided otherwise. The first night it happened, the sky above Gallowmere was clear and brittle, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The air hung heavy with the scent of cane and ash, and the frogs along Bayou Dufresne had gone silent hours earlier. In that silence came the sound, faint at first, like distant thunder rolling beneath the soil. Then came the rhythm, slow and deliberate, metal striking metal in perfect intervals. The hammering carried across the fields, across the slave quarters, across the veranda where Abram Voss sat drinking bourbon he hadn't earned. It was the sound of work, but it was wrong. It came at a time when no one was meant to be awake, when even the crickets had fallen quiet. The enslaved in their shacks lay still, whispering prayers too soft for words. They knew that sound, or at least thought they did. It was the hammer of Solomon Griggs, the blacksmith whose fire never truly went out. But the rhythm was off. It wasn't the steady pulse of a man shaping iron, it was slower, heavier, as though the earth itself was echoing back. Each strike seemed to sink into the ground and rise again through the soles of their feet. By the 5th hour, even the bravest among them refused to look toward the forge. Voss, restless and irritated, lit his lantern and stepped out into the night. The moonlight was pale and sharp, cutting through the mist that curled across the fields. He could hear the hammering more clearly now, coming from the edge of the property where the trees met the fog. It grew louder as he walked, until the sound seemed to come from all around him, bouncing from the water and back into the air. When he reached the forge, there was no fire, no movement, no sign of life. Only the anvil stood in the dark, steaming faintly as if it had been touched by something hotter than flame. By dawn, the plantation stirred again. Smoke rose from the chimneys, roosters called out into the thick morning air, and the hammering had stopped as suddenly as it began. Solomon stood outside his forge, his clothes clean, his face calm, his hammer resting exactly where it always was. The overseer demanded to know what he had been making, though no one else had seen him lift a tool. The old man's voice was quiet, but it carried through the courtyard like a sermon. The people of Gallowmere spoke little of that night afterward. But for weeks, the ground near the forge stayed warm long after sunset, and the air around it smelled faintly of iron and rain. Some claimed to see shapes moving in the reflection of the anvil, faint outlines of figures bent in prayer or labor, as if the past itself had returned to finish something left undone. Others said the hammering was not Solomon's at all, that it came from below, from the tunnels beneath the house, where the walls still breathed and the soil remembered every name buried within it. Whatever had been forged that night, no one could say. But the old ones whispered that the swamp had heard its first promise in years, and that Gallowmere would never sleep the same again. Morning came heavy and wet, the kind of Louisiana heat that settled deep into the lungs. The fields shimmered beneath a thin haze, and the air clung to the skin like a second layer. The men and women of Gallowmere moved slower than usual, as if the earth itself were warning them to tread carefully. The day began with the cry of a boy, thin, high, and sharp enough to slice through the fog. He had been caught with a jar of molasses hidden in his shirt, his hands sticky and trembling. The punishment came quick. Abram Voss wasted no time in making an example of him. He gathered everyone to the clearing near the quarters, that small patch of dirt where all lessons were learned the hard way. The whip cracked once, twice, and then again, each strike echoing off the trees like thunder that refused to die. The boy's voice faded to gasps, and then to silence. The people stood still, eyes lowered, hearts heavy with helpless fury. They had seen it before, too many times, yet something about this felt different. The air changed, turning thick, almost electric. Even the cicadas went quiet. Solomon Griggs stood a few paces away, his shadow long and unflinching. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply watched. The old blacksmith's eyes were calm, but there was a weight behind them. Something ancient, and knowing that even Voss could feel. Abram raised his arm to strike once more, but the handle of his whip split clean down the middle. It fell from his hand with a dull thud, the leather twisting like a dying snake in the dirt. The overseer froze, staring at it in disbelief. The silence that followed was suffocating. The boy lay still. The others waited for Voss to shout, to curse, to strike someone else out of anger. But no sound came. He stood there for several seconds before stepping back, his expression pale, his lips pressed thin, his hand trembled faintly as he turned away. No one dared look directly at him, yet every soul on that field knew what they had seen. The whip had broken, and not by accident. That night, the air in the quarters felt colder, though the fire burned strong. The story spread in whispers, carried from mouth to mouth, from bunk to bunk. Some said the swamp had taken offense. Others said Solomon had called something from the iron itself. Whatever it was, the message was clear. Gallowmere had begun to wake. The next morning, the overseer's eyes were red from sleeplessness, and his voice cracked when he gave orders. He blamed the humidity, the age of the whip, anything that could explain away the fear creeping into his bones. But the workers noticed how he avoided the forge now, how he no longer met the old blacksmith's gaze. The land had sent its first warning, and though Abram Voss would never admit it aloud, he had already begun to understand what kind of place he was standing on. Gallowmere did not forget, and it did not forgive. Sunday came softly to Gallowmere, carrying a rare stillness with it. The sky was pale and washed, the kind of color that seems to have forgotten how to be blue. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and crushed cane. By mid-morning, the plantation moved slower than usual. Work paused. Even Abram Voss, strict in every other respect, allowed the day its illusion of rest. The enslaved gathered in the shadow of the great oaks near the edge of the fields, where the soil dipped slightly toward the bayou. The trees there were older than memory, their limbs wide and heavy, draped in Spanish moss that swayed like ghosts in the breeze. Solomon Griggs stood beneath the largest of them, his back straight, his hands folded before him. The people came quietly, barefoot and weary, their bodies marked by labor but their eyes steady. They did not sing hymns or shout their faith like the white folks in the chapel up the hill. Their worship was quieter, older, carved from a time before words. They spoke to the earth more than the heavens, to the roots beneath their feet, to the water that carried memory through the swamp. When Solomon spoke, his voice was deep and unhurried. He did not preach of salvation or forgiveness, but of remembrance. He told them that roots remember what the leaves forget, that the past never truly dies, it only sinks deeper into the soil. As he spoke, a wind stirred that did not belong to the weather. It brushed through the moss and rippled across the field, bending the cane in long, slow waves. The people bowed their heads. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called 3 times. The air grew heavy, and for a moment, it felt as if the land itself was listening. When the prayer ended, no one moved. It was as if they feared breaking whatever quiet power had descended upon them. Then, slowly, they drifted back to their cabins, leaving Solomon alone beneath the trees. That night, the dogs began to howl. It started with one, then another, until the sound rolled across the plantation like a tide of grief. They howled without pause, their cries rising and falling, echoing through the cane fields and over the still waters of the bayou. The overseer cursed from his window, but even he did not step outside. By midnight, the moonlight was trembling through a low mist, and the air tasted of metal. When morning came, the wind was gone, the sky bright and empty. The people found the church bell lying in the dirt beside its tower. The rope had not been cut, the beam had not broken, and no storm had passed through in the night. It simply lay there, heavy and silent, a relic displaced. Some said it had fallen as a sign, others said it had been pulled down by invisible hands, a warning to those who no longer listened. Whatever the truth, from that day forward, no one at Gallowmere spoke during Sunday prayer without first touching the earth. They wanted it to remember them. Sleep came to Abram Voss in short, broken intervals. The nights at Gallowmere had grown heavy, full of noises he couldn't explain, sounds too slow for the wind and too human for the swamp. It began quietly, with dreams that felt too vivid to dismiss. He would wake in the darkness drenched in sweat, convinced he had heard footsteps just beyond the door, slow and patient, followed by the faint rhythm of dripping water. At first he told himself it was rain seeping through the roof or the sound of the bayou shifting in the night. But it hadn't rained in weeks, and the water near the house was still. Each morning, he found the same thing waiting at the foot of his bed. His boots, lined neatly side by side, filled halfway with mud, thick, black, and wet, the kind that came only from the swamp behind the forge. The first time, he thought it was a cruel trick. He accused the workers, searched the quarters, even threatened punishment. But no one spoke, and the looks they gave him were not of guilt, they were of pity. The mud kept returning. Some mornings it was damp, other mornings nearly dry and cracked, as though it had been there for hours before he woke. Then came the dreams that were not dreams at all. He began to see Solomon Griggs standing in the corner of his room, tall and unmoving, the faint glow of fire reflecting in his eyes. Sometimes the old blacksmith said nothing, only watched. Other times, the hammer in his hand gleamed as though just pulled from the forge. Voss would bolt upright, heart racing, only to find his room empty except for the smell of iron and smoke. The walls sweated moisture that shouldn't have been there, and the sheets felt cold, as if someone had just stepped away. The fear began to follow him into daylight. He started locking his door even during meals, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting a shadow to speak. He drank more, muttering about the swamp seeping into the house, about footsteps that paused when he listened and resumed when he didn't. The other workers noticed the change, the tremor in his hands, the hollowness in his eyes. Even the dogs avoided him now, whimpering when he passed. By the end of the second week, Voss no longer slept at all. The sound of dripping water never stopped, echoing through his dreams and his waking hours alike. Sometimes it seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, sometimes from the ceiling above. He tore through the house one night searching for the leak, but there was none. Only the sound, patient and rhythmic, keeping time with his heartbeat. When he looked out his window toward the forge, he thought he saw a faint red glow pulsing in the distance, steady and alive. He blinked, and it was gone. Yet he knew then that Solomon Griggs had not left his dreams behind. He had followed him into the waking world, and the swamp itself had learned his name. The first to notice was one of the kitchen girls, a quiet woman named Ruth who drew water from the courtyard well before sunrise. She lowered the bucket as she always did, listening for the soft splash far below, but when she pulled it up, the rope burned her palms. The bucket came heavy and slow, its surface glistening with a dark sheen that caught the morning light. At first, she thought it was mud stirred from the bottom, but when she tipped the water into her basin, the smell hit her thick and metallic, like old coins left too long in a sweaty hand. The water wasn't brown or cloudy, it was red. By noon, the entire plantation knew. The servants carried buckets from the well to show the overseer, their voices trembling with fear. The water shimmered like liquid rust, deep and unnatural, and when left sitting in the sun, it darkened to the color of dried blood. Abram Voss stared at it for a long time before ordering the well sealed. He told himself it was iron deposits, some trick of the soil, a natural occurrence that meant nothing. But the smell was wrong. He couldn't shake it from his hands no matter how much he scrubbed. The workers whispered that night, trading stories that the old ones had carried from generations before. They said the earth was bleeding, that the well had been built over bones, that the swamp had grown tired of silence. Some claimed to see bubbles rise from the ground near the forge, thick and slow, as if the land itself was exhaling. Others said they saw shapes moving in the reflection of the water, faces that vanished the moment they blinked. Solomon Griggs was seen standing near the well at dusk, his expression unreadable, the red light of the setting sun turning his eyes into coals. When asked what he thought it meant, he spoke softly, almost to himself. "The land remembers its debt," he said, "and it never forgets to collect." That night, the overseer dreamed of the well. He saw it deeper than before, the rope stretching endlessly downward, the bucket spinning slowly in the dark. When it hit bottom, the sound wasn't water, it was the dull slap of flesh. He woke, gasping, his mouth dry, his sheets damp with sweat. The next morning, he found that the water in his own basin had turned faintly pink. The same metallic taste lingered in the air, clinging to every breath. Voss ordered a new well dug farther from the house, but the men refused to break ground. They said the soil there was soft and warm, and that the spades sank too easily, as though the earth wanted to swallow them whole. He threatened punishment, but no one moved. Even his horse refused to drink from the trough, rearing and snorting at the smell. The fields began to wilt within days. The sugarcane browned at the tips, and the leaves curled inward as if retreating from the sky. When the preacher from Greensburg was summoned to bless the land, he arrived sweating and pale. He sprinkled the courtyard with holy water, but it beaded on the ground like oil. His voice faltered halfway through the prayer, and when he finished, he refused to stay the night. Before leaving, he told Voss quietly that he'd seen something in the well's reflection, something watching him from below. By the end of the week, the red water had vanished as suddenly as it came. The well ran clear again, and the air seemed lighter, but the relief didn't last. Every morning after, when the overseer drew a fresh bucket, there was always a faint tint left behind on the rope, a stain that deepened with time. The servants stopped drinking from it altogether, choosing instead to collect rainwater from the roof. But even that began to taste strange, faintly bitter, as though the sky itself had learned the flavor of iron. Voss tried to ignore it, tried to work, to command, to convince himself the plantation was still his. Yet every time he walked past the sealed well, he felt a pulse beneath the ground, subtle but steady, like a heartbeat buried just beneath his feet. And sometimes, in the stillness between dusk and dawn, when the frogs stopped singing and the air grew still, he could swear he heard the faint creak of rope moving through the darkness, pulling something up from a depth no man was meant to touch. The letters were found years later, sealed in a small cedar box beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been the mistress's bedroom. The paper had yellowed with age, and the ink had turned the color of dried blood, but the words were still legible, elegant, careful, and trembling with the kind of fear that never speaks its name. They were addressed to a woman named Celeste Laveau in Baton Rouge, though no evidence suggested they ever reached her. The handwriting belonged to Miriam Laveau, the mistress of Gallowmere, a woman whose beauty had once been the envy of the parish and whose eyes, people said, had gone hollow long before her body followed. The first letter was polite, restrained, the way women wrote when they were expected to say everything without saying anything. She spoke of her husband's growing temper, of sleepless nights filled with the sound of hammering from the forge. She mentioned that Abram Voss, the overseer, had begun to lose his composure, that he prowled the house after dark with a pistol in his hand. "He believes the blacksmith watches him through the night," she wrote, "and sometimes I believe it too." In the second letter, the tone shifted. Miriam described the house itself as though it were breathing. She wrote of footsteps in the hall when no one was there, of the faint smell of iron drifting through the rooms, of the way the mirrors fogged over even when the air was still. She confessed that she had begun hearing whispers when she stood near the well, the same well that had run red only weeks earlier. "I think the earth beneath this house is sick," she wrote, "and whatever it hides has learned to speak." The third letter, dated only days before she vanished from the parish record, was almost frantic. Her words crowded the page as if she feared she would run out of time. She wrote that her husband had taken ill, that his eyes were sunken, his hands shaking. He spoke of nightmares that followed him into daylight, of seeing Solomon Griggs near his window, unmoving, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Miriam claimed she had seen it too, not Solomon, but the shape of something else, something that watched from beyond the trees near the forge. It looked like the shadow of a man, but when it moved, the ground moved with it. The letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, her handwriting trailing off into a blot of ink. The following morning, she had disappeared. Some said she fled to Baton Rouge to escape her husband's madness. Others whispered that she never left Gallowmere at all, that the swamp claimed her the way it claimed everything that overstayed its welcome. When the letters were discovered decades later, the floorboard beneath her bed was still stained a faint reddish brown. The box had been sealed so tightly it took effort to pry it open, and when it was, the air that escaped smelled faintly of iron and lilies. Each sheet of paper was folded perfectly, untouched by decay, as though the house itself had preserved them. The letters from Miriam Laveau became one of many quiet legends that haunted Gallowmere, one more whisper in a story already too heavy with them. They were proof, some said, that even those who owned the land were never safe from what slept beneath it. The house had listened to her fears, had kept her words safe, and had hidden them until the time was right for the story to surface again. Because at Gallowmere, nothing buried ever stayed buried, not bodies, not sins, and not the words of a woman who understood too late that her home was alive and waiting. It began with a sound, a faint hiss, like breath escaping from a wound. The workers in the fields noticed the smoke first, curling upward from the mill just after dusk, pale against the sky and strangely slow to rise. Abram Voss was the first to call it a fire, though what burned that night defied every rule of nature. The flames that took hold in the mill were not orange or gold, but a deep, shimmering blue, cold and steady, like a candle in the windless dark. The people of Gallowmere gathered near the edge of the field, watching in silence. The fire made no roar, no crackle, no heat. It spread without haste, as if it knew exactly where it wanted to go. The wood of the mill blackened but did not crumble, and when the smoke touched the iron gears and chains, they twisted and bent as though the metal were soft clay. The overseer ordered the men to fetch water, but none dared approach. Every step closer to that unnatural light brought with it the smell of blood and burnt sugar. Inside the flames, something seemed to move. Shadows wavered through the blue light, long and thin, like ribs pressing through flesh. When the last of the chain pulleys snapped and fell, it struck the ground with a hollow sound, echoing through the field like a bell from beneath the earth. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the fire stopped. There was no smoke, no ash, no smoldering ruin, only silence, and a smell that lingered, sharp and metallic, clinging to the air long after the last glow faded. When dawn came, the mill stood in eerie stillness. Its walls were blackened but still upright. The roof had caved slightly in the center, and the iron gears that powered the grinders had melted into grotesque shapes. Some resembled bones, ribs curved into impossible arcs, a spine coiled into itself, a wheel fused into what looked like the shape of a jaw. The people who saw it said it was the fire giving the mill its true form, showing what it had always been beneath the surface, a machine that fed on blood and labor, now stripped of its disguise. The only building left untouched was Solomon Griggs's forge. Not a single ember had crossed its threshold, though it stood no more than 20 yards from the mill. The roof of the forge gleamed faintly, its metal tiles free of ash. When the workers approached, the anvil was warm to the touch, and the hammer beside it lay exactly where it always had. Solomon himself was seen standing nearby, silent, his expression unreadable. Some said he had been there all night, his eyes fixed on the burning mill, watching as if witnessing a debt being paid. Abram Voss refused to speak of the fire. He ordered the ruins cleared, the melted metal buried, the ground washed down. But no matter how much water they poured, the soil beneath the mill stayed warm. The scent of iron never faded, not from the air, not from their hands, not even from the overseer's clothes. At night, when the wind came from the west, it carried with it the faint echo of grinding wheels turning in the dark, though the mill was gone. In the days that followed, the plantation seemed quieter. The birds stopped nesting in the rafters, the cane fields grew still, and the dogs would not go near the site of the fire. The people whispered that the blue flame had been a cleansing, a reminder from the land that it remembered every drop spilled into its soil. And though the overseer forbade them from speaking Solomon's name aloud, they did anyway softly, with reverence, as if invoking an ancient spirit. For everyone at Gallowmere understood one thing now. The swamp had a will of its own, and through Solomon Griggs, it had found a way to make itself heard. The nights at Gallowmere had grown unnaturally quiet after the fire. The cane fields no longer whispered, the frogs no longer sang, and the hum of insects seemed to vanish after sundown. What replaced it was a kind of stillness that felt alive, as though the air itself were waiting. Then came the sound that broke it, the bell. It was Isaiah Reed who first heard it. He was no more than 12. A small boy with wide eyes and a sharp ear for things others dismissed. One night he woke to a faint ringing drifting through the darkness, soft but clear, carrying over the fields like the echo of a forgotten prayer. The bell from the chapel tower had not rung in years. The rope had rotted, the beam had cracked, and after the storm that toppled it months before, it lay silent beside the church ruins. Yet Isaiah swore he heard it. Once for the mule that died in the field that morning. Twice for the man who collapsed in the cane and never rose again. 3 times for someone still living, someone who, the boy said, would vanish before the week was done. At first, the others told him to hush. They said it was wind through the branches, or frogs returning to their song. But then the next day, a man did disappear. He had gone to fetch water from the bayou and never returned, leaving only a bucket floating downstream. That night the bell rang again. The sound became a rhythm in the dark, sometimes faint, sometimes so near it seemed to come from the walls themselves. It tolled not with metal or rope, but with something heavier, as if the weight of each ring came from the ground beneath Gallowmere. The enslaved began to keep count. 1 for the animals, 2 for the living, 3 for the souls soon to be taken. They prayed by whisper now, their words soft enough not to draw attention from whatever listened. Abram Voss refused to believe it. He claimed it was hysteria spreading among fools. But when he passed the churchyard one evening, he saw the bell lying in the dirt just as it always had, cold and still. Yet the moment he turned his back, the ringing began again, low, slow, and steady, vibrating through the soles of his boots. He fled without looking behind him. The strange tolling continued for nights afterward, moving through the plantation like a pulse. Some said it came from the tunnels beneath the house, others from the swamp that breathed in rhythm with it. The dogs would whimper and hide, their ears pressed to the ground. Even the crows stopped gathering in the trees. It was as though every living thing on that land could hear something calling from below, something counting its way through the depths of Gallowmere. By the 7th night, no one slept. The bell rang once more, its tone heavier than before. Those awake swore it carried words this time, a name folded inside the sound. The next morning, one of the stable hands was gone, his bed empty, his boots left neatly by the door. The ground outside his cabin was soft, freshly turned, though no shovel had touched it. Isaiah never spoke of the bell again after that. He wouldn't go near the church or the forge, and he slept with dirt from the bayou pressed into his hands, whispering that it would keep him safe. The adults never told him that nothing could keep anyone safe from the swamp once it started calling names. Because at Gallowmere, the bell didn't mark time. It marked the living, and it was far from finished. By the time Sheriff Luther Cade rode out from Greensburg, the stories from Gallowmere had already begun to spread through the parish like a fever. People whispered of missing workers, of fires that burned blue, of wells that bled. Cade was not a man given to superstition. He had dealt with his share of drunks, thieves, and killers, and he believed the living caused enough trouble without needing help from the dead. Still, as his horse carried him down the narrow road toward the plantation, even he couldn't ignore how quiet the woods had become. The birds were gone, the air thick and still, and the swamp on either side of the road glistened like black glass beneath the afternoon sun. When he reached the edge of the property, Cade found Abram Voss waiting for him. The overseer looked nothing like the man he had once been described to be. His clothes hung loose, his eyes red and hollow, and the smell of whiskey clung to him like a second skin. The sheriff saw the tremor in his hands, the darting movements of his eyes, and the unspoken terror that had taken root inside him. Voss stammered through his report, speaking of disappearances and strange lights, of hammering that echoed through the night, even when the forge stood cold. He swore that the land was cursed, that the swamp itself had turned against him. Cade listened, but he heard only a man unraveling under the weight of his own cruelty. He told Voss what he told every man who drank himself into fear: ghosts were born of guilt, not graves. If he was haunted, it was by his own reflection. The sheriff took his leave as the sun began to fall behind the trees, promising to look around before returning to town. He rode past the church ruins, past the well that had been sealed with boards, and down toward the field where the forge sat, like a black heart beating quietly in the distance. Smoke drifted from its chimney, though no fire had been lit that day. The smell of iron and something faintly sweet filled the air. Cade dismounted, meaning to take a closer look, but the sound that met him froze him where he stood. It was faint at first, like metal being dragged through water, then clearer, a slow, steady rhythm, the sound of hammer against steel. The sheriff called out, but the noise did not stop. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the cane, through the trees, through the very ground beneath his boots. His horse reared and pulled at the reins, nostrils flaring, eyes rolling white. Cade grabbed for the saddle, but the animal bolted, vanishing into the thickening mist. The sheriff was last seen walking toward the forge, lantern in hand, his figure fading into the fog. The workers who claimed to have watched from a distance said the light flickered once, twice, then went out. For 3 days, no one saw him again. On the 4th morning, his horse was found grazing near the river, its flanks streaked with mud, its eyes wide open and unblinking. The saddle was still on its back, the reins torn, and the leather smelled faintly of smoke. When they searched for Cade, the only thing they found near the forge was his badge, half buried in the dirt, the metal warped as if it had been caught in flame. The people of Greensburg said he must have gotten lost in the swamp, that he had drowned like so many others before him. But those who lived and worked on Gallowmere knew better. They said the land had taken him, just as it had taken the rest. That night, the sound of hammering returned, ringing louder than ever, carrying over the fields in a rhythm that matched a heartbeat. And in that sound, some swore they could hear a new voice, low, steady, and begging to be let out. The forge at Gallowmere had always been a place of order. Every tool had its place, every piece of metal was shaped with precision, and the steady rhythm of Solomon Griggs's hammer was as constant as the rising of the sun. But one morning, that rhythm was gone. When the workers approached the forge, they found Solomon standing in silence, staring at the anvil as though seeing it for the first time. The iron surface, once smooth and blackened with years of labor, was now covered in markings. They were not scratches or dents from the hammer, but deliberate carvings, deep, intricate, and perfectly aligned. Circles intersected with lines, small crosses cut clean into the metal, and symbols no one recognized stretched across every inch of its surface. The edges shimmered faintly in the light, as though the markings had been burned into the anvil rather than carved. No one could imagine how it had been done. The iron was too thick, too hard to cut, and there were no filings, no tools left out, no trace of anyone's hand. The old man offered no explanation. He worked as though nothing had changed, though he did not strike the anvil once that day. By evening, word had spread across the plantation. Some said the symbols were the language of the dead, that the swamp had spoken through Solomon. Others whispered they were signs of protection, a barrier between the living and something waiting beneath the soil. A few swore they saw the lines move when no one was looking, glowing faintly as dusk settled over the bayou. Abram Voss was not a man who tolerated mysteries he could not control. He stormed into the forge the next morning, pistol at his side and fury on his face. He demanded the markings be removed, called them superstition, claimed Solomon had done it himself to frighten the workers. But when he ran his gloved hand across the surface, he flinched. The anvil was cold as river stone, yet the air around it felt alive, humming faintly like the echo of a bell. Voss ordered 2 men to bring sledgehammers and break it apart. They hesitated, but under his gaze they obeyed. The first blow fell hard, echoing across the courtyard like thunder. The sound that followed was not of metal striking metal, it was sharper, deeper, as though the anvil had struck back. The sledgehammer's head split in 2, shards scattering across the floor. The second man dropped his tool and fled. Voss lifted the remaining hammer himself, swung once more, and the handle snapped clean in his grip. His palms split open, blood streaking the wood. The anvil remained untouched. After that, no one tried again. The forge stood empty for days, yet the symbols grew darker, as though feeding on the air itself. When the moon rose, the lines caught its light and gleamed faintly blue, the same unnatural hue that had burned through the mill. Those who worked nearby said they could hear a low vibration in the air, steady and pulsing, like a heartbeat made of iron. Voss avoided the forge after that night, but he could not stop hearing it. The sound followed him to his quarters, into his dreams, into the silence that came just before dawn. He began to feel the weight of the symbols even when he wasn't looking at them, as if they were written not on the anvil but on the very ground of Gallowmere itself. The workers learned to walk around the forge in a wide circle, their eyes downcast, their voices hushed. The next rain fell hard and sudden. When it passed, the markings were still there, untouched by water or time. The ground steamed, the air smelled of sulfur, and the swamp behind the forge rippled, though no wind stirred it. Whatever had written those symbols had not come from Solomon's hand. It had come from something older, something the land had buried and now wished to remember. Morning broke over Gallowmere with the kind of stillness that feels wrong, the kind that presses against the skin and makes the birds forget their songs. The fog hung low over the cane fields, pale and heavy, curling like breath over the black soil. It was the cook who saw it first, stepping out into the yard just after sunrise, the overseer's whip hanging from the chapel door. The leather was coiled and knotted into a shape so intricate it seemed almost deliberate, as though made by hands that understood patience more than haste. It hung perfectly centered, its handle turned upward like an offering. No one touched it. The whip had been Voss's pride, a symbol of the control he once wielded over the plantation. Its sound had ruled the fields, its shadow enough to silence 100 voices. Now it hung lifeless and still, gleaming faintly with dew. When word reached the overseer, his face drained of color. He accused the workers first, threatening punishment, but his voice shook when he said it. The knot was too complex to have been tied in the dark, too precise to have been the work of trembling hands. The strands overlapped in perfect symmetry, each loop locked within another. It looked less like a rope and more like a message. Voss reached for it anyway. The moment his fingers brushed the leather, the smell of salt and blood rose in the air, sharp and unmistakable. He tore it down, but the whip didn't uncoil. It held its shape as if alive, stiff and unbending. By noon, his palms began to blister, small red welts blooming in the same twisted pattern as the knot. He wrapped his hands in cloth, cursed the sun, cursed Solomon, cursed the land itself. Yet the pain didn't fade. It throbbed beneath the bandages like something growing, like a second heartbeat trying to crawl out. The people of Gallowmere watched quietly. They had seen this kind of reckoning before, not in form but in meaning. The swamp had its own way of balancing debts, and no man ever escaped its notice for long. That afternoon, the dogs refused to go near the chapel. They barked at the empty doorway, their fur standing straight, their voices cracking in fear. The church itself seemed to shift in the light, its shadow stretching longer than it should, creeping toward the forge where the blacksmith worked in silence. By the second day, the blisters on Voss's palms had darkened. The skin split open in thin lines that matched the shape of the knot, and every time he closed his fists, a faint trace of red seeped through the bandages. The smell of blood followed him everywhere. It clung to his clothes, to the sheets he slept in, to the water he tried to wash with. The servants whispered that the whip had taken something from him, that it was no longer his to command. When the night came, the air turned colder than it had in weeks. Voss dreamed of the chapel door, of the whip still hanging there, swaying gently in the wind. He could hear it creaking, a slow rhythmic sound that echoed through his skull like the tolling of a bell. When he woke, the room smelled of salt again, and his bandages were damp. The whip itself had vanished, though no one saw who took it. The next morning, faint tracks led from the church door toward the swamp, a single trail pressed deep into the mud, as though something had been dragged across the ground. Voss followed them until they disappeared into the reeds, but the sound of the leather creaking stayed with him long after. From that day on, he could not walk past the chapel without feeling the skin on his hands tighten and burn. The whip that had once been his power had become his punishment, and Gallowmere, in its own quiet way, had marked him as its next offering. The disappearances began quietly, as most curses do. At first, it was only a mule, a stubborn animal that refused to drink from the trough near the forge. It was found missing one morning, its rope still tied to the post. The ground around it churned into soft mud as though something had pulled it down rather than led it away. The air smelled faintly of sulfur. By evening, whispers began in the quarters, carried from one trembling mouth to another. The mule had been taken, they said, swallowed by the same earth that had turned the well red and burned the mill blue. 3 days later, a man vanished. He had been sent to fetch iron scraps from the blacksmith's shed, a task he had done 100 times before. He never came back. His tools were found stacked neatly by the door, his footprints ending at the edge of the bog that bordered the forge. The ground there was wet but undisturbed, as though it had closed over itself after swallowing him whole. Abram Voss told the others to search, shouting until his voice cracked. But no one moved past the fence line. They had already decided the swamp had taken him. When a second man disappeared the following week, the fear settled like mist over Gallowmere. The workers refused to go near the forge after sundown. They claimed the air there grew thick and hot, that the anvil still hummed even when the fire was cold, and that strange shapes flickered in the reflection of the water pooled outside the shed. Some said they heard a rhythmic sound beneath the ground, faint but steady, like metal being struck far away. Others said they saw footprints appear in the mud, one at a time, leading toward the swamp before fading completely. Abram Voss tried to explain it. He said the men had run away, though he couldn't say where. He rode through the night searching for them, pistol drawn, eyes wild, but every path he took ended in mud and silence. The swamp seemed to shift around him, guiding him in circles until even his horse grew restless. When he returned at dawn, his boots were caked with red clay, and he spoke less boldly than before. On the seventh day, the bog beside the blacksmith's shed began to bubble. The sound rose like boiling water, thick and unnatural. The stench of rot and iron filled the air, driving even the insects away. Voss ordered the area drained, desperate to prove the disappearances had some earthly cause. The men dug with shovels, the water thickening with every strike, until something solid clanged against the metal. When they cleared the muck, they found a circle of nails sunk deep into the earth, each one bent and blackened, arranged with eerie precision. In the center of the ring sat a single boot, half burned, its sole curled and brittle. The leather was eaten through, the heel still steaming. No one spoke. The air pressed down, heavy as a storm. Voss demanded the pit be filled, but the men refused. They backed away one by one, crossing themselves, their eyes fixed on the circle. When night came, the ground began to tremble softly, and the water that remained turned dark as ink. By morning, the hole was full again, as if it had never been touched. That night, the sound of hammering returned. It echoed faintly across the fields, slow and patient. And every time it struck, the dogs began to howl. The people of Gallowmere understood what it meant now. The land had stopped warning them. It had started claiming what was owed. And under the cold glow of moonlight, the forge shimmered with a faint red light, as if something deep within the swamp had begun to breathe. The night the hammer stopped was unlike any other in the long memory of Gallowmere. For years, the sound of Solomon Griggs's forge had been as much a part of life as breath itself, a heartbeat of iron that pulsed through the plantation day and night. Even in storms, when lightning danced across the bayou and the wind howled through the cane, that steady rhythm continued. It was the sound that told the people dawn would come, that work would resume, that life, however cruel, still moved forward. But on that night, it ended. The silence began at dusk. No one noticed it at first. The workers had returned to their quarters, the last light of day sinking behind the trees. The cicadas were beginning their chorus, and the frogs sang from the edge of the swamp. Then someone realized the forge wasn't burning. No smoke rose from the chimney. No orange glow lit the shed. The air around it was still and cool, the smell of soot replaced by the faint scent of rain and metal. By the time word reached the quarters, the truth had settled like fog across the fields. The forge of Gallowmere had gone dark. People gathered quietly near their doors, staring toward the edge of the property where the forge stood like a tomb. No one dared approach. The older ones said it was not their place to disturb what had finished its work. They whispered that old iron had struck his final blow, that the hammer had done what it was meant to do. Some prayed. Others wept softly without knowing why. And through it all, the swamp lay perfectly still, as if listening. Abram Voss paced his quarters, torn between fear and fury. The forge had been the one constant, the one sound that defied him but comforted the workers. Without it, the nights felt wrong, incomplete. He sent 2 men to check on Solomon, but neither returned. Their absence was met with resignation, not surprise. The people of Gallowmere simply said the swamp had no use for them anymore. It had taken what it needed. As the hours passed, a strange glow began to rise from the water beyond the cane fields, not fire, not moonlight, but something in between. It shimmered faintly, spreading in ripples that touched the edge of the forge. The anvil caught the light and reflected it, and for a moment, those who watched from afar swore they saw movement inside the darkened shed. Some said it was Solomon's shadow. Others said it was the land itself breathing through him. When midnight came, the glow faded. The night fell heavy and absolute. The forge remained silent. Not even the insects dared to fill the void it left. The swamp had swallowed the last sound of iron, and Gallowmere felt emptier than it ever had before. The next morning the workers crossed themselves before setting foot outside. They spoke softly, repeating the same words like a prayer or a warning. Old Iron's work was done. No one saw Solomon again after that night. His hammer was found resting on the anvil, spotless and cold, its surface gleaming as though newly forged. The ground around it was damp, but not with rain. It pulsed faintly underfoot, a slow, steady rhythm that matched no living heart. And from the depths of the swamp, far beyond the edge of the fields, a low hum began to rise, a sound that wasn't made by wind or beast, but by something older, patient, and now fully awake. The night Abram Voss lost control of Gallowmere began with a sky that would not settle. Thunder rolled without rain, lightning flashed behind a wall of unmoving clouds, and the air pressed down like a hand too heavy to breathe beneath. The plantation had grown quiet since the forge went dark, too quiet. Not a single song came from the quarters, not a word from the workers as they moved through the fields. Fear had replaced exhaustion as their burden, and fear, when left to ripen, becomes anger in men who once believed they ruled the world. Voss had been drinking since sundown. The whiskey burned less with each swallow, until the fire in his chest was the only one left on the land. The silence of the forge mocked him. The whispers of the workers grated like insects in his ear, and every creak of the house felt like laughter he couldn't locate. He swore Solomon Griggs had done this, that the old blacksmith's quiet defiance had poisoned the soil, had turned the swamp itself against him. By the time he reached for his pistol, reason had long abandoned him. He stormed from his quarters, torch in one hand, iron at his side. The dogs barked and then whimpered, retreating to the shadows as he passed. His boots sank deep into the mud. But he didn't slow. The night carried his shouts through the fields, rough and breaking. He called for Solomon by name, dared him to show himself, dared the swamp to answer. When he reached the quarters, the door frames flickered orange from his torchlight. Faces watched from the dark, eyes wide, unmoving. Voss stood in the center of the yard, sweat and rain mixing on his skin, the torch shaking in his fist. His voice cracked as he demanded obedience, demanded silence, demanded someone to blame, but no one moved. The air grew thicker, and from somewhere deep in the cane, a low hum began, a sound that didn't belong to wind or insect, rising like a voice too old to remember its words. Solomon appeared then, stepping from the shadows at the edge of the forge. He didn't carry his hammer. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at Voss the way the earth looks at the sky during a storm, patient, unmoved. The overseer lifted his pistol, his torch flaring brighter as if defying the darkness itself. He shouted something about power, about God, about fear. His words tangled together, lost beneath the rising hum that now pulsed through the ground. Finally, Solomon spoke, his voice low and steady. It carried farther than it should have, reaching every ear like a whisper through water. "It don't save," he said. "It remembers." The wind came then, sudden and strong, bursting from the direction of the swamp. It swept through the quarters and struck the torch from Voss's hand. The flames sputtered once, then died, leaving the yard in darkness. The overseer's pistol fired a single shot into the night, followed by silence, then screams. They rose like a chorus, distant at first, then closer, raw, and broken. By the time the sound stopped, the storm had passed. When morning came, the workers found the pistol half buried in the mud, its barrel bent as though gripped by something far stronger than any man. The torch lay beside it, its wood blackened but cold. Near the edge of the swamp, where the water met the reeds, they found Voss's hat. Nothing else. The people didn't search for him. They knew where he had gone. The swamp had taken its due, had added another name to the memory it guarded beneath the water. And though the land was still again, no one mistook it for peace. It was only the quiet that comes when something ancient has finally been fed. By sunrise, Abram Voss was nowhere to be found. The sky broke open in thin streaks of gray, the kind of light that reveals everything but explains nothing. Dew clung to the cane, heavy and cold, and the air smelled faintly of iron. The first worker to pass by the forge stopped dead when he saw it. Voss's pistol lay half sunk in the mud, its barrel warped, the metal blackened as though it had been held in flame. The ground around it was darker than the rest, wet, not from rain, but from something thicker that shimmered under the morning light. Closer to the anvil, the earth steamed. The mist rose in soft curls, steady and slow, as if something beneath the surface exhaled. The anvil itself gleamed faintly, untouched by soot or rust, the markings carved into it darker now, pulsing faintly like veins. A single boot print led up to it, pressed deep in the mud, and stopped there. No return track, no drag marks, no struggle. Just one step forward, then nothing. It was as though Voss had walked into the forge and been swallowed whole. By mid-morning, word had spread through the plantation. The workers gathered in silence, keeping a distance from the forge but unable to turn away. They spoke in low voices, saying the swamp had taken him, that the earth had finally answered Solomon's promise. "The land don't forget," one of the women whispered. "It just waits." The overseer's quarters were left as they had been the night before, bottle on the table, candle burned down to wax, coat still hanging on its hook. His bed was unmade, the sheets damp as if someone had lain in them only moments earlier. The dogs were found hiding beneath the porch, trembling, their eyes fixed toward the direction of the forge. Sheriff Luther Cade's horse had been found weeks earlier, but no one went looking for another man in Gallowmere now. The swamp was not a place to retrieve the lost, it was a place that claimed what was owed. Still, a few men tried to follow the trail near the edge of the property, more from duty than courage. They made it only as far as the line where dry land met bog. There the air thickened, the water darkened, and a faint vibration hummed through the ground. It felt like a pulse. One man swore he saw bubbles rise in the distance, slow and deliberate, as if the swamp itself was breathing. He turned back before the first burst reached the surface. By dusk, the forge began to sound again. Not the full ring of hammer and iron, but a low, rhythmic thump that came at uneven intervals. It was quieter than it had been when Solomon worked there, almost cautious, almost human. No one approached. The anvil glowed faintly under the moonlight, and the air around it shimmered with heat, though the night was cold. The following morning the steam was gone, the ground was dry, the pistol had sunk completely into the mud, leaving only the faint imprint of its shape. The people avoided the forge altogether, walking wide around it, their eyes lowered, their mouths moving with silent prayers. They said Solomon's work was finished, that the swamp had found its voice again through him. Others said something had replaced the overseer, something that now lived beneath the anvil, waiting. And when the night wind swept through the cane and the air carried that faint metallic hum, no one dared to speak Voss's name aloud. Because at Gallowmere, even the dead had to stay quiet if they wished to rest, and the living knew that what had vanished into the swamp was not gone at all. It was only listening. It had been nearly a month since the swamp took Abram Voss, and the quiet that followed felt unnatural, as if Gallowmere itself were holding its breath. The days moved slower, heavy with humidity and dread. The nights came darker than before, moonlight dimmed by a haze that never lifted. No one dared speak the overseer's name. The forge still stood silent by day, yet when the sun sank beyond the tree line, a faint rhythm echoed from it, soft, metallic, deliberate. Those who heard it swore it was the sound of hammering, though the forge had long gone cold. Then, one morning, the dogs began to bark. Their howls carried across the fields, breaking the stillness like a warning. The first to look out from the quarters saw it, a horse staggering through the mist, ribs showing beneath its hide, its reins dragging behind like a broken thread. The animal was coated in dried clay that cracked with every step, the color wrong for the land pale gray, streaked with streaks of orange and white. The soil of Tangipahoa Parish was dark and red. This was not. It looked like earth pulled from somewhere else entirely. When the horse reached the edge of the yard, it stopped. Its eyes were wide and glassy, its flanks quivering with exhaustion. There was no rider. The saddle was torn, the stirrup bent, as if something heavy had tried to climb down and never made it. No one approached it first. They recognized the markings burned into the leather. It was Sheriff Luther Cade's horse, the same one that had disappeared with him weeks before when he came to investigate the disappearances, the same horse they had buried in rumor and fear. The animal stood for hours without moving. Then, as dusk fell, it lifted its head toward the forge and let out a low, trembling sound, a noise closer to a moan than a whinny. The people swore they heard something answer, a single, distant clang, faint and hollow, drifting from the direction of the anvil. The horse began to move again, slowly, deliberately, as though following the sound. By the time the last light faded, it had reached the forge. Steam curled up from the ground around its hooves, though the air was cool. It lowered its head once, pawed the earth 3 times, and went still. When morning came, it hadn't moved. The workers found it standing exactly where the sound had led it, eyes open but lifeless, body cold. Around its legs the soil was wet not with rain, but with a thin film of water that smelled faintly of iron. The sheriff's badge was found lodged in the mud beneath one hoof, its metal warped just like Voss's pistol had been. The horse's shoes were etched with small circular grooves, the same pattern as the symbols that marked Solomon's anvil. No one could explain it. The animal hadn't come from the road or the trail to Greensburg. Its tracks simply appeared from the edge of the swamp, winding through reeds and water that no living thing should have crossed. That night, the hammering grew louder. It came in steady waves, carrying across the fields like a heartbeat rising from the ground. The sound reached even the main house, rattling the glass in its windows. The people whispered that the sheriff had come back, not his body, but his debt. They said the horse had been sent to return what the swamp had claimed, to remind Gallowmere that every trespass leaves an echo. The following morning, the forge door was open. Inside, the anvil glowed faintly, not with heat, but with light. A soft red that pulsed like breath. The badge was gone. The horse's body was gone too, only its tracks remaining, pressed deep into the mud before fading into nothing at the edge of the bog. The hammering stopped that night, replaced by a new sound, faint, distant, and sorrowful. It was the creak of leather, the slow jingle of spurs, and the measured tread of boots walking where no path remained. And those who listened longest swore they could hear a man's voice whispering low beneath it, calling for help from a place far deeper than the swamp itself. No one saw the water coming. There had been no rain for days, no storms rolling from the Gulf, not even a change in the wind. Yet, sometime between dusk and dawn, the ground began to tremble with a sound that seemed to rise from beneath the roots. The frogs fell silent first, then the crickets, until Gallowmere lay wrapped in a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. When the first man stepped outside his cabin, the bayou had already begun to rise. The water came without warning, dark and fast, swallowing the paths between the fields before anyone could cry out. It poured through the cane, sweeping stalks from their roots and carrying them away like driftwood. By midnight, it had reached the cabins, then the stables, then the edge of the great house itself. It wasn't rainwater or river water, it was heavier, darker, thick with the smell of rust and something far older. The swamp had opened its veins. The people climbed onto rooftops, clutching each other, listening to the sound of their world drowning. In the distance, lightning flashed with no thunder, illuminating the surface of the water as it surged through the trees. Beneath that eerie glow, things moved, shapes too large to be fish, too slow to be carried by current. The horses screamed from their pens, the dogs vanished into the woods, and through it all, the forge remained untouched, its anvil gleaming faintly like an eye staring out from the flood. By dawn, the water began to recede as suddenly as it had come. The fields, once bright with cane and corn, were now a mirror of gray. The cabins leaned, the fences half buried, the earth slick and scarred. The workers moved through the mud in silence, too frightened to speak. Where the water had been deepest, near the forge and the old church ruins, the ground steamed. The air reeked of iron, and scattered across the field, glinting in the weak light of morning, were fragments, metal shards, shaped like remnants of bodies. They found buckles first, green with corrosion, then buttons, twisted into spirals. Nails were scattered in perfect lines, as if they had grown from the soil. Each piece looked as though it had been pulled from the earth rather than dropped onto it, like the ground itself had coughed them up. The shapes were strange, some curved like ribs, others small and jointed like fingers. The people collected what they could, though none dared keep the pieces. They piled them at the edge of the swamp, covered them with branches, and whispered prayers to the water that had both taken and returned. No human remains were found, not one bone, not one scrap of fabric from the missing. The earth had given back only iron, as if the men and beasts that disappeared had been reforged into the very tools of the land. By evening the flood had vanished, leaving the ground dry once more. The sun returned, but its warmth felt wrong, thin, distant, as if the light had traveled through something that remembered darkness too well. That night, as the crickets dared to sing again, the faint sound of hammering drifted across the bayou. 3 strikes, then silence. The sound was deeper than before, slower, almost like the rhythm of something breathing just beneath the surface. The people knew better than to go looking for the source. They said the swamp had finished its work, that it had risen not to destroy but to cleanse. Still, when they passed the fields the next morning, the iron fragments were gone. Only shallow impressions in the soil remained, shaped like vertebrae leading toward the forge. The swamp had swallowed its offerings again, content for now, but alive and listening, waiting for the next name to remember. After the floodwaters drained and the earth settled again, a strange calm descended upon Gallowmere. The cane fields lay flattened, the cabins leaned like old men too tired to stand, and the house itself seemed smaller, its white walls stained with the color of the swamp. But for the first time in months, the nights were still. No hammering, no screams, no distant bell tolling in the dark. The air was heavy with quiet, the kind that doesn't bring peace, only the echo of what it has taken. Solomon Griggs went back to his forge as if nothing had changed. The anvil still gleamed faintly in the dawn light, though the symbols carved into it had grown dark, almost invisible. He worked each day in silence, shaping horseshoes and plowhooks for a plantation that no longer needed them. The overseer was gone, the master's house nearly abandoned, and half the field hands had vanished or fled. Yet Solomon remained. He kept the forge burning even when no one came to collect what he made. To those few who passed near, the sound of his hammer was steady, slower now, more deliberate, like a man striking in rhythm with the heart of something only he could hear. He never spoke of the night the swamp rose. When asked, he only nodded once, as though acknowledging a debt long settled. Some said he was the cause of it all, that his hammer had called up something buried deep beneath the parish, something that wanted to remember its pain. Others said he had saved what could be saved, that the storm and the flood had not been punishment but release. No one knew for certain, and Solomon never said. Years passed. The land changed hands, but no one stayed long. The fields grew wild, the fences rotted, and the church bell, once the voice of Gallowmere, sank into the ground, leaving only a hollow where it had hung. Through it all, Solomon lived alone near the forge, his beard long and white, his back bent but unbroken. Those who came to him for work claimed his eyes held the reflection of fire, even when the coals were cold. They said the air around him hummed faintly, that the earth beneath his feet trembled when he lifted his hammer. When death came for him, it did so quietly. One morning, The forge was cold, and the hammer lay where it had fallen. Solomon Griggs was found sitting beside the anvil, head bowed, hands folded as if at prayer. The fire had gone out in the night, and yet the iron beneath him was still warm, as though something deep within it had drawn his last breath and kept it. They buried him where he sat, beneath the anvil itself. The people said it was his will, that no other ground could hold him. The anvil was too heavy to move, so they built the earth up around it, shaping the mound like a grave marker. The next spring, grass grew wild across the plantation, reclaiming what had been lost everywhere except that spot. The soil above his resting place stayed bare, dark and smooth, like cooling metal. Years turned to decades. The story of Gallowmere faded into legend, told in whispers by riverboat men and travelers passing through. But on still nights, when the moon hung low over the bayou, some claimed they could hear a faint ringing coming from the old grounds. Not thunder, not wind. The sound of iron striking iron, slow and steady, keeping time with the heart of the swamp. They said it was Solomon Griggs at work beneath the earth, forging something the living would never see. Something meant not to save, but to remind that the land never forgets, and the dead remember everything. Years after the war ended and the fields of Gallowmere were left to rot, the story of the barefoot man began to drift through the bayou like fog. It started with the fishermen who cast their nets near the old levee and returned wide-eyed, claiming the water had turned warm beneath their boats. They said a man had walked across the shallows in the early light, barefoot and silent, carrying a hammer that glowed red as a coal. His reflection never rippled, and the air around him shimmered like heat rising from an unseen forge. They swore that when he passed, the frogs stopped croaking and the wind forgot how to move. For that brief moment, even the swamp seemed to hold its breath. The locals called him Old Iron, though few dared speak the name after dark. Some said he was Solomon Griggs, risen from the soil that refused to cover him. Others whispered he was something older, an echo of the swamp itself wearing the shape of a man. They said the hammer he carried was the same one that once struck life into Gallowmere's heart and death into its oppressors. Wherever he walked, the air carried the faint scent of smoke and iron, and in his wake, the water stilled as if listening. By the time the Reconstruction years came, the land where the plantation once stood had nearly vanished. The big house had collapsed into its foundation, the church tower had sunk into the mud, and the forge lay half swallowed by reeds. The anvil, however, remained half-buried, uncorroded, untouched by time. River traders refused to camp near it. They said it hummed at night, low and steady, as though waiting for the return of its maker. Some nights, the light of distant fires could be seen through the mist, flickering red like breath against glass, and the faint rhythm of hammering carried across the bayou 3 slow strikes, followed by silence. Children who grew up along Bayou Dufresne learned not to wander after dusk. Their elders warned that if they followed the sound of metal in the dark, they would find footprints that glowed faintly in the mud, too large for any living man. And if they kept walking, they would come upon a figure standing knee-deep in the water, eyes lit from within like embers. He would not speak, only lift the hammer once before vanishing into the fog. Those who claimed to have seen him said the world around them grew still, as though time itself had stopped to listen. As the years passed, the story changed but never faded. Sailors told of strange lights that glimmered beneath their boats at night, like coals burning deep underwater. Hunters spoke of hearing iron strike far off in the cypress groves, though no human sound could travel that far. Some swore that the land itself shifted where Gallowmere once stood, that the ground pulsed faintly, alive, like a buried heart. By the early 1900s, the swamp had reclaimed everything. Only the name survived in old maps and whispered tales. Yet every generation had one or two who swore they saw him, the barefoot man in the fog, walking the edge of the water, hammer in hand. They said he appeared when storms gathered, when the air turned heavy, when the earth began to remember. The hammer glowed red as if newly forged, and the light danced across the water like blood under glass. They said he never looked back, never spoke, never stopped, only walked the same path again and again, tracing the boundary between what was and what would not rest. And when he passed, the world grew still. No frogs, No wind, no ripple on the bayou's surface, only the sound of something eternal. A quiet pulse that could have been the land, or the last heartbeat of a man who had once forged his vengeance into legend. Long after Gallowmere was forgotten, long after the last of its stories turned to rumor, travelers still felt it when they crossed the Bayou du Fray. A hush in the air, a taste of metal on the tongue, a sense that the swamp was listening, waiting. And when the mist thickened, some swore they saw him again, the barefoot man, the red hammer, the ghost of Solomon Griggs walking through the still water. The living called him a spirit, the swamp called him memory. And in that silence where the earth met the sky, old iron walked on, keeping the rhythm of a promise that had never cooled.